In the fall of 1887, Pittsburgh was a city on the rise, a smoky, booming landscape of iron, ambition, and unimaginable wealth. The Gilded Age was in full flourish, and nowhere was its glitter more blinding than in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue's grand estates. Among them, the Van Wyck mansion stood like a fortress of prosperity, red-bricked, columned, and guarded by wrought iron gates taller than a man. Charles Van Wyck, the man behind its walls, had made his fortune in steel, ascending swiftly through the ranks of Pittsburgh's industrial elite. A reserved and calculating figure, Charles was respected by men of industry and feared by many who worked under him. His reputation for precision, for cold efficiency, had helped build an empire. His wife, Eleanor, by contrast, was the city's favored jewel. At 27, she embodied the modern woman of her age, elegant, inquisitive, and bold in a way that drew admiration as easily as it stirred envy. She had grown up in Philadelphia society, the daughter of a respected judge, and married Van Wyck not out of desperation, but from what seemed at first to be shared ambition. She was a socialite of poise and presence, and while her husband preferred backroom dealings and private ledgers, Eleanor brought warmth and vitality to the Van Wyck name. Her public appearances were frequently reported in the Gazette, her gowns described in detail, her charity work lauded. She hosted poetry salons and musical evenings, and counted among her acquaintances artists, philosophers, and the occasional political firebrand. Yet behind the lace and laughter, there were murmurs, barely audible then, but in hindsight unmistakable. Eleanor had taken to walking the grounds alone at dusk, sometimes refusing visitors without explanation. She had grown thinner that autumn, pale in a way that powder could not conceal. Servants whispered of arguments behind closed doors, sharp words, a shattered vase, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the chandeliers. Some said her husband had grown possessive. Others suggested Eleanor had begun to chafe under the restrictions of her role. No matter how gilded the cage, it remained a cage all the same. A close friend, a widow by the name of Lillian Hoyt, recalled Eleanor once staring absently at the Allegheny River and saying, "To be free, truly free, I'd give everything I own." At the time, it had seemed like a dramatic but harmless musing. The weeks leading up to her disappearance were filled with a contradiction. To the public, Eleanor appeared radiant as ever. She attended the theater, rode in charity parades, and posed for a painted portrait commissioned for the city's centennial gala. Yet, in private, her lady's maid reported that Eleanor had taken to locking her bedroom door at night. She began writing in a small journal she kept hidden in her sewing box, and more than once she burned letters before they could be posted. Charles Van Wyck seemed unbothered, or perhaps determined not to reveal what troubled him. He maintained his usual routines, spending his days at the homestead works and his evenings in the smoking room, sipping brandy beside the ticking long-case clock. When asked about his wife's health, he replied briskly, "She is merely fatigued by the season's demands." If he suspected anything more, he did not show it, or would not. On October 12th, the city's Philharmonic Society held its annual gala performance, a highly anticipated social affair at the Grand Opera House. Eleanor arrived in a sapphire silk gown, her hair pinned with real pearls, and seated in the front row. Several witnesses recalled her demeanor as distant, though polite. At intermission, she excused herself and never returned to her seat. According to the coachman, she requested to be driven home early. By morning, she was gone. No note, no luggage, no sign of forced entry or violence, only an open window, a faint perfume, and silence. The night of Eleanor Van Wyck's disappearance was soaked in rain, the kind that turned cobbled streets to slick black ribbons and smudged the gas lamps into halos. Pittsburgh's Grand Opera House, where the city's most prominent gathered beneath domed ceilings and velvet drapery, had hosted a resplendent performance. Eleanor, as always, arrived impeccably dressed, sapphire silk, a silver fan, and that strange air of detachment she had carried for weeks now. She sat quietly through the first act, alone in her private box. A few acquaintances waved. She acknowledged them with a faint smile, her eyes distant, as though she were watching a memory instead of the stage. Shortly before the second act began, she rose from her seat and slipped through the curtains. The usher stationed outside remembered her scent, violets, and that she had spoken softly, asking for her carriage to be prepared. She said nothing about feeling unwell. She simply descended the stairs, stepped into the rain beneath her parasol, and vanished into the night. The coachman, Thomas Bell, was found just after dawn, slumped beside the Van Wyck carriage on a muddy back road near Shenley Park. His coat was soaked, his temple bloodied, and his hands bruised as if he'd fought something, or someone. At first he said nothing, drifting in and out of consciousness, while a constable summoned a doctor. When he finally came to, his story was halting, wild, and riddled with gaps. According to Bell, Eleanor had asked to be taken not to the mansion on Fifth Avenue, but toward the river, specifically to a stretch of wooded road near Glenwood. This was strange. The route was poorly lit, mostly deserted, and far from the Van Wyck estate. But Bell claimed she was calm, even insistent. She said she needed air, that she would be just a few minutes. When they reached the spot, she had stepped out of the carriage and walked into the trees with her parasol still open. Bell waited, watching the trees sway under the wind and rain. Then he heard a sound, a sharp cry, or perhaps a command. He turned, stepped down from his seat, and that's when he claimed something struck him from behind. He awoke hours later in a shallow ditch beside the road. The horses had remained, though one had broken its harness. The interior of the carriage was empty. Eleanor's parasol lay near the wheel, snapped in two. The police found the area already trampled by mud and hooves. No footprints, no blood, no torn fabric. It was as if Eleanor had stepped into the dark and disappeared into mist. The Van Wyck household fell into chaos. Charles, stoic and collected in the eyes of the public, was reportedly enraged behind closed doors. He stormed through the house, questioned the servants, demanded immediate involvement from the mayor and the Pinkertons. A reward of $5,000 was offered, a staggering sum at the time, for any information leading to Eleanor's safe return. Pittsburgh erupted. Newspapers ran banner headlines. Heiress vanishes in storm. Society beauty feared taken. Rumors churned. Had she been kidnapped by union agitators eager to punish her husband for his ruthless anti-labor policies? Had she eloped with a secret lover? Or was this, as some whispered, a carefully staged disappearance, Eleanor's final act of defiance? Yet others looked with suspicion at the coachman's tale. His wounds, while visible, were superficial. Why would she ask to be driven to such a strange and secluded place? Why had Bell not resisted more, not fought harder? When pressed, his answers faltered. He could not describe his attacker. He claimed his lantern had gone out. He swore that Eleanor, it seemed, like she was saying goodbye. And what of Charles? He maintained a rigid face in public, granting interviews, shaking the hands of police captains. But his cooperation was curiously incomplete. Certain documents went missing. A chambermaid was dismissed within days without explanation. Charles refused to let police search parts of the estate's private quarters, calling it unnecessary and intrusive. Still, there was no body, no ransom, no letter, only a broken parasol in the mud, and a coachman's broken memory. And so Eleanor Van Wyck passed from woman to mystery. As the news of Eleanor Van Wyck's disappearance spread through Pittsburgh, the city's polite society bristled with speculation. The morning after her unexplained absence from the Philharmonic Gala, her name was on every tongue, her photograph, an engraving adapted from her last public portrait, plastered across the front pages of the Pittsburgh Dispatch and Gazette. "Heiress vanishes after gala," read the headlines, but the words beneath them were far less certain. Was she kidnapped? Had she met with foul play? Or, more scandalously, had Eleanor simply run away? At first, sympathy bloomed. She was, after all, young, beautiful, and admired. But sympathy is a fragile thing, especially among the elite. Within days, whispers sharpened into accusations, murmured behind gloves at garden parties, or passed along through gossiping housemaids. Some claimed Eleanor had grown tired of her arranged life, that the Van Wyck marriage had always been more merger than romance. Others recalled how she had often spoken with a particular softness when discussing Paris, or how her eyes lingered on certain visiting gentlemen longer than propriety allowed. There were rumors, slippery and persistent, that she had once written letters to a bohemian poet who had stayed at the McAllister estate. A love affair, perhaps, a secret rendezvous gone wrong. Then there were those who cast suspicion in a darker direction, toward her husband. Charles Van Wyck's silence, at first interpreted as grief, began to feel too rehearsed, too precise. He declined public interviews, avoided social functions, and insisted he was cooperating fully with the police. Still, the absence of tears, of pleas, of even the simplest public statement of hope for his wife's return, unsettled many. Those who had done business with him were reminded of his cold pragmatism, the same efficient cruelty that allowed him to shut down entire mills during wage disputes without blinking. That man, one rival industrialist reportedly said, would bury his grief in ledger books if it meant not losing face. The police, under immense pressure, were divided in their approach. Captain Dunley, a veteran officer with a grudge against the city's upper crust, suspected foul play from the beginning. Yet the Van Wyck household was powerful, insulated by money and influence. No warrant was issued for Charles. No formal accusations were made. Still, there were hushed investigations, servants questioned discreetly, carriage logs examined, old letters retrieved from waste bins. But in the absence of physical evidence, every path seemed to lead only to more questions. Complicating matters were Eleanor's own contradictions, if she were so unhappy. Why continue to host parties, attend concerts, and perform her public duties? Why not confide in her friends, many of whom insisted they had no inkling of discontent? Or had she confided and simply not been believed? Some suspected her disappearance was a carefully planned escape, a bid for freedom from a life that had grown stifling. They pointed to recent bank withdrawals, modest but irregular, and the reported sighting of a woman, matching her description, boarding a train in Braddock the day after she vanished. The account was never confirmed. Other theories bordered on the bizarre. A spiritualist medium from Philadelphia arrived, claiming she had seen Eleanor's aura drifting west. A story circulated of a veiled woman who had been seen wandering along the Monongahela River docks at night, speaking to herself in French. The Van Wyck family dismissed such accounts as nonsense, but even that dismissal invited doubt. Why so eager to disprove? Why so reluctant to look deeper? By November, what had begun as a personal tragedy had transformed into a citywide obsession. Society columns speculated with the flair of fiction writers. One broadsheet even published an anonymous letter suggesting Eleanor had discovered incriminating documents related to her husband's business, documents that could destroy the Van Wyck empire. If true, what might Charles have done to silence her? Or had someone else, perhaps a rival, seized upon her vulnerability for leverage. The truth was lost in the noise. Reputations frayed. Dinner invitations were declined. Friends turned cautious. The Van Wyck estate, once a place of music and light, now stood shrouded in suspicion and cold marble silence. Reputations frayed. Dinner invitations were declined. Friends turned cautious. The Van Wyck estate, once a place of music and light, now stood shrouded in suspicion and cold marble silence. As the days turned into weeks and no trace of Eleanor Van Wyck emerged, Pittsburgh's calm veneer began to crack. What had started as quiet whispers in drawing rooms quickly turned into a roaring storm of speculation and fear. The city was on edge, nervous, watchful, and obsessed. This was no ordinary woman who had gone missing. Eleanor Van Wyck had been part of the city's very image, a symbol of grace, culture, and wealth. Her vanishing was not simply a domestic mystery, it was a public wound. The police investigation floundered from the start. Chief Inspector Holloran, a broad-shouldered man known more for his ability to intimidate pickpockets than solve intricate cases, admitted privately to colleagues that he had little to work with. The coachman's story remained murky. He insisted he had been attacked while returning to the opera house to retrieve Eleanor's forgotten shawl, but the head wound he suffered told only part of the tale. Some speculated he had been drinking. Others believed he had been paid, though by whom no one could say. His story changed subtly with each retelling, and when pressed under oath, he collapsed into tears and was declared unfit for further questioning. He was later sent to a sanatorium in Westmoreland County. Meanwhile, Charles Van Wyck maintained an icy, calculated calm. He offered a reward of $5,000, an enormous sum in 1887, for any information leading to his wife's return. But he refused interviews and declined the assistance of the Pinkerton Agency, which only fueled suspicions. Newspapers speculated wildly. Some suggested Eleanor had fled the city, escaping a cold marriage. Others leaned toward darker conclusions, printing lurid illustrations of imagined crime scenes and exclusive witness accounts from servants no one could name. The Pittsburgh Gazette and the Chronicle-Telegraph competed for the most dramatic headlines. "Steel Baron's bride abducted," shouted one. "Secret lover spirited her away by train. Evidence of elopement," screamed another. Neither article cited facts, but both sold thousands of copies. For the working class and middle class alike, the story provided a glimpse into the lives of the untouchably wealthy, revealing that even behind marble walls there were cracks. Amateur sleuths began to swarm the Van Wyck estate, peering through iron bars, sketching the grounds, even bribing servants for scraps of gossip. One man claimed to have seen Eleanor on a train heading west, seated beside a man with a mustache and carrying a French novel. A week later, a shopkeeper near the Strip District insisted Eleanor had visited her millinery shop incognito, buying a plain gray hat and veil. Each tip fizzled into nothing, but they added fuel to an already blazing fire. Then came the seance craze. Local spiritualists, emboldened by the attention and profits, claimed to have contacted Eleanor's spirit. At one infamous gathering in Shadyside, a medium declared in a trance, "She is beneath the river. The cold takes her breath." Though no evidence followed, it was enough to send search parties combing the Monongahela and Allegheny banks. Nothing was found. In the midst of this chaos, the police received anonymous letters written in a tight, slanted script. One claimed Eleanor had been seen near the ironworks, walking barefoot at dawn. Another insisted she had been taken against her will by political radicals. A third simply read, "She knew too much." Investigators were baffled, and more than a few began to question whether the answers they sought lay not in the city's alleyways, but within the estate itself. With no official progress, The city's attention became increasingly divided, some convinced of foul play, others believing Eleanor had orchestrated her own vanishing. Rumors swirled that she had secret accounts, that she had withdrawn money weeks before her disappearance, that she had corresponded with someone in Chicago. But for each claim, a contradiction arose, and the truth remained elusive. What began as a society scandal had now become a psychological weight on the entire city. People double-locked their doors. Women avoided walking alone after dark. Even children whispered stories of the lady who vanished in the night. Pittsburgh, a city built on steel and certainty, found itself haunted, not by ghosts, but by the unbearable mystery of what had happened to Eleanor Van Wyck. Nearly 3 weeks after Eleanor Van Wyck vanished into the fog of that October night, the city of Pittsburgh remained awash in theories, gossip, and fear. The newspapers printed fresh speculations daily, and society women clutched their shawls tighter at every whispered rumor. The police, despite pressure from above and mounting public outrage, had few leads that extended beyond the speculative. They had interrogated the coachman until his voice broke, raided boarding houses from Allegheny to Homestead, and even searched the muddy waters of the Monongahela, but nothing substantial had surfaced. Until the morning of November 5th. It was a coal barge worker named Amos Delaney who stumbled upon the clue. He had been tending his small cabin near the river's edge, close to the rail yards that sat beneath the soot-darkened skyline. The cabin, no more than a lean-to with a stove and cot, was meant for occasional rest between shifts. As he bent to retrieve kindling beneath the floorboards, his hand brushed against something cool and metallic wedged between a crack. At first he assumed it was a coin, but when he pulled it out and turned it over in the morning light, the breath caught in his throat. It was a brooch, delicate, gold, and unmistakably expensive, shaped like a lily with a sapphire center. Delaney might have pocketed it, sold it, or said nothing. But fear, or perhaps conscience, got the better of him. He brought it to the police station, where the item was quickly identified by Eleanor's maid as one she'd seen worn often. Charles Van Wyck confirmed it himself, though his reaction was disturbingly muted. The brooch, he said, had been a wedding gift. That it should turn up in a coal worker's shack sent ripples of alarm through every level of society. Detectives arrived at Delaney's cabin within the hour, combing the premises for signs of Eleanor. They questioned Delaney thoroughly, and though rough in manner, his answers held up. He claimed he had no idea how the brooch came to be there. But in the days that followed, neighbors remembered seeing a woman, veiled and alone, passing through the rail yard path late one evening in October. A few even thought they had heard a female voice arguing with someone behind the warehouses, though whether it was real memory or invention, no one could say for sure. More curious still was what police discovered nearby, a collection of discarded papers and fragments of fabric buried behind a woodpile. Among them was the torn corner of stationery bearing the initials EVW, and a tiny monogrammed handkerchief stained with something that looked suspiciously like blood. Beneath the dirt and oil of the worker's world, the outline of something stranger began to emerge, a possible double life, or at the very least, secrets Eleanor had carefully hidden from her public image. Investigators followed the trail into the seedier corners of the city. There they discovered that a woman, matching Eleanor's description, had visited a particular bookshop more than once in the months before her disappearance. It was a place known for radical literature and clandestine meetings, frequented by anarchists, writers, and union men. The shopkeeper recalled her vividly. She had asked for pamphlets about self-governance and requested a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. Something about the way she spoke had struck him as out of place, as if she belonged to another world. This discovery led to more speculation. Had Eleanor been involved with someone politically subversive? Was she sympathizing with the growing labor movements that her husband's fortune worked so hard to suppress? The thought sent shudders through Pittsburgh's upper crust, already on edge from the escalating tensions between workers and industrialists. If Eleanor Van Wyck, darling of high society, had indeed been meeting with radicals, it would have been scandal enough to undo reputations for years. But no clear answer emerged. Every clue gave birth to more questions. Some believed Eleanor had staged her disappearance, leaving behind just enough to suggest a crime, while others insisted she had been murdered and her secrets buried with her. Still, a few clung to the idea that she was alive, watching from the shadows, perhaps living under another name, in another city, beyond the reach of her husband's empire. No body was ever found. Decades passed, and still no trace of Eleanor Van Wyck was ever conclusively found. The city changed around her absence. Steel mills gave way to office towers, soot-stained mansions crumbled or were converted into museums and schools, and the name Van Wyck slowly faded from polite society's memory. But Eleanor's story, her vanishing, persisted. It refused to be buried. Her face, painted in oil and still hanging in the Pittsburgh Historical Society's East Wing, watched over the generations that followed, her expression too calm for a woman who vanished without a word. It became a kind of local myth, told in whispers at dinner parties and recounted in detail by amateur historians, with a glint of conspiracy in their eyes. By the turn of the century, the mystery of Eleanor's disappearance had taken on the contours of legend. Newspapers from as far as Chicago and New York occasionally ran anniversary stories about the ghost of Fifth Avenue. Theories abounded. Some insisted she had drowned herself in the Monongahela River, overwhelmed by the pressure of her marriage and a life not entirely her own. Others claimed she had staged her escape with meticulous care, slipping into obscurity under an assumed name, perhaps to Europe, perhaps to the American West. A particularly persistent rumor suggested she had been seen in San Francisco under the name Nora Vance, teaching music at a girls' boarding school. No solid evidence ever emerged. The Van Wyck estate never publicly reopened the investigation. Charles Van Wyck died in 1894, still refusing interviews and offering no closure. His will left no mention of Eleanor. His body was buried in a family vault behind iron gates, the same ones she had walked through the night she vanished. It was said he had removed every personal item of hers from the house by the following spring, donating her books to a convent and her gowns to the Daughters of Charity. Yet some rooms remained closed, locked, untouched, until the estate was sold in 1911. As time wore on, the story took on stranger turns. Children whispered that her ghost walked the edges of Highland Park, or that on certain October nights, her silhouette could be seen in the upper window of the long-abandoned Van Wyck mansion. Several accounts from the 1920s claimed a woman, matching Eleanor's description, had been seen placing flowers at a grave marked Only T. Av in a cemetery south of Pittsburgh. Nothing came of it. By the 1940s, the case became a favorite of university folklore courses and regional history societies. A few authors tried to fictionalize her tale, painting Eleanor as everything from a romantic runaway to a victim of elaborate murder. One of the most widely read accounts, published in 1953 by local writer Hazel Broomfield, theorized that Eleanor had been silenced by those closest to her, perhaps for threatening to reveal financial fraud committed by her husband's business associates. The book, while speculative and not well received by scholars, sold well enough to cement the mystery in pop culture. Then, in 1972, a curious discovery reignited public interest. During renovations of a Pittsburgh law office that had once been part of the original Van Wyck Legal Trust, a workman found a small tin box wedged behind a false panel in a brick wall. Inside were several yellowed letters, a silver hand mirror, engraved with Eleanor's initials, and a dried corsage identical to one she had worn the night of her disappearance. The letters, never officially released in full, suggested that Eleanor had felt trapped, watched, and betrayed by someone close to her. One line, frequently quoted in later reports, read, "Freedom, if it comes, will not come without cost." Despite renewed calls for a formal review of the case, the documents were quietly archived, and the mystery remained. To this day, the case of Eleanor Van Wyck is still classified as an unsolved disappearance. Tour guides in Pittsburgh occasionally include her story in historical walks, stopping outside the site of the old Van Wyck mansion, now replaced by a nondescript office building. Flowers still appear every October beneath her portrait in the museum. No one claims to place them. No one ever has. Her fate, like so many stories born in the twilight of the Gilded Age, belongs more to myth now than to fact.